Good morning. If you're stuck in auto or you're switching to full manual because you think that's what real photographers do, well, you might be missing some of your best shots. And this applies whether you just picked up your first camera or you've been shooting for years. Look, today I want to show you what each camera mode does and why the overhead manual mode is actually slowing you down and how I use my camera modes in order to stay creative, get sharp photos, and stay focused on my stories. I'm going to share with you a specific setup that feels like cheating, gives you total control over the look of your photo while letting the camera do the heavy lifting. So make sure you watch until the end because I'm going to reveal a special secret that will make missed shots a thing of the past. So if you're ready, let's get right into it. And thank you PPA for sponsoring part of this video. More on that later. Here's a reality check that took me years to accept, honestly. The vast majority of world-class street and documentary photographers are not shooting in full manual. They don't. Why? Because life happens in front of you. You don't have 5 seconds to spin 3 different dials, check your light meter, look at your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed. By the time you're done, your moment is gone forever. And to avoid that, they actually use semi-auto modes. And today I'm going to show you exactly how to set up yours up. And I just want to say it, semi-auto is not a dirty word. Don't romanticize the manual. And tell me in the comments actually, if you're team manual, team auto, team semi, what are you? First, the biggest trap. Ta-ta! Full auto. The full auto mode is a trap, and there's another one that may be a little more surprising to you. So full auto decides for you of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The camera does everything for you, but the problem is that it doesn't know your creative vision. So that's not really photography, that's just pointing and praying, hoping the camera knows if you want to shoot a silhouette, do a long exposure, or actually shoot a portrait. Look, the cameras make it better, smarter with that, but no, this is still a big trap. And the other big trap is to follow the romantic idea that you need to be shooting full manual. In full manual, you become an accountant of your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. You're always fitting those 3 numbers in order to get something right. And most of the time, your exposure meter is kind of lying to you. More on this later. If you take an example of a dark background with the subject walking in the ray of light like you can see on these images, you end up with an issue. Why? Because you are trying to expose for that background because of what your light meter, but actually your subject is in full light. So it gets complicated, and by the time you're done fiddling the right settings, the scene is gone, the subject is gone. You missed the shot. And there's a fun fact, maybe some of you remember. Photographers back in the days of films used to calculate the exposure by hand. In bright sun, they would go f16 and then the shutter at 1 over the ISO. So let's say you had an ISO 100, you go 1 over 100, so 100 of a second, or 1/400 if you have ISO 400. It works, but it proves exactly why we have smarter and better ways to do things nowadays. And the surprise is that most people aren't even using them. So if auto is blind and manual is slow, where do we start? Well, we start with the storyteller mode, and it has a hidden setting buried in the menu that most photographers never find. Surprise, right? I thought I talked about it enough, but clearly not. So let's dive into it. The storyteller's mode, or little aperture priority. Think of your aperture as your dial in for attention and ease of reading your subject, not just a number. So literally, the wider your aperture, so the smaller your f-stop number is going to be, for example, 1.4 to 8, and the more separation you will have between your subject and your background. Extremely helpful, right? Now, the bigger the number, the tighter your aperture is, suddenly the background gets sharp, the street is sharp, you can see all the leaves and the full story for full context. And in choosing aperture, my friends, is one of your most important creative decisions as a photographer. Do you want to include a lot of context for your image and your story? Or do you actually need to only see the subject with the widest aperture possible and the smallest f-stop number? So, most people plateau here because they set their camera in A mode and then they just trust the meter blindly. Well, here's a problem. The exposure compensation is going to be your steering wheel. You have to anticipate the scene. You have to dial in your exposure compensation before you raise the camera. Why? For example, remember my scene with that really dark background and the people walking in that ray of light that is extremely bright? Well, in those circumstances, I need to dial in my exposure compensation, that little wheel, or at the back of my camera before I start shooting in order to compensate for the fact that my camera with the light meter is going to try to expose even for the darkness, but I want the darkness. I just want to expose for that person in the bright point. So I'm gonna go maybe -1 on my exposure compensation and thus create something that is more moody and much more visually appealing for my story and for my style. Just remember that. You want something moody, just dial down your exposure compensation. You want something a little more airy and brighter, bring up that exposure compensation a little bit, and your camera will overexpose slightly everything. Now you need to check at the back of your camera because we have mirrorless cameras with real-time feedback. It's great. So just look at it if you need, but you don't have to think about your shutter speed. You don't have to think about your ISO. All this is taken care of by the camera. All you have to decide is on the depth of field you want in your image and if you want to compensate a little bit your exposure or not. Hey, if you're enjoying these practical tips, I go way deeper into actually how to see the light, how to compose, how to retouch, the whole process of really thinking and shooting like a professional photographer in my 30-day to great photo course. There's a link in the description. I invite you to learn more and maybe join the next session. Now I get it, before I get burned in the comments, some of you will mention Aperture Priority has one huge flaw, which is the camera automatically drops the shutter too low in certain conditions, and you don't want that. Your subject ends up blurry. If you're shot in Aperture Priority and you have blurry subject, that is probably why. The camera was like, oh, there isn't enough light. I'm trying to keep the ISO low. So you know what? I'm going to reduce the shutter speed. But you're shooting someone moving and you're like, hey, I wanted that person to be frozen. So what do? You go to that little hidden menu setting that is called minimum shutter speed or ISO minimum shutter speed, depending on your camera. And there you can tell the camera, please do not drop that shutter speed for whatever reason below a certain number. Honestly, here are a few quick rules. Just set 1/250 of a second if you're in the streets in daytime, 1/500 of a second if you know you're gonna have faster subjects, or use the mode faster that may be in your camera and tweak that. I would use faster for anything with like kids and people walking pretty fast, and then the mode fast for every day when I'm hand holding and I'm in daytime. Honestly, I wouldn't use the slow selection. And if you really are doing action and you have, let's say, birds or animals or cars going very fast, go 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second and higher. But honestly, you have to adapt a little bit depending on the situation. I have a full video on the photography basics and the exposure triangle that you can watch that will really give you more insight onto how to balance these. But honestly, if you're shooting Aperture Priority with your ISO minimum shutter speed set at 1/250 of a second in your everyday photography in daytime, you're probably not gonna get blurry shots because of a shutter speed that was set too low by the camera. This is literally a never miss photo mode, and most photographers have actually never even opened that menu to set it, which is kind of a surprise. But yeah, hopefully that helps you. Do you have insurance on your gear? Is your gear secured? What happens if someone steals your camera? What happens if it breaks? Do you have an insurance? If you don't, check out PPA. PPA stands for Professional Photographers of America, and it's in the company that provides equipment coverage that protects your gear, whether it's stolen, damaged, or lost. And it goes beyond just replacing your camera. They also provide legal support, copyright protection, education, and even help with data recovery if your memory cards are compromised. Through PPA, you can get up to $15,000 of gear insurance, $50 flat deductible for equipment repairs, and $350 deductible for full replacements of equipment lost. Make sure if you have a drone that you add the drone policy, get $25 off your first year with PPA, and get on the field with peace of mind. Now let's talk about shutter priority, S or TV. My honest take is that it's the most misunderstood mode on your camera, and it has a really dark side that nobody warns you about. Look, shutter priority is for controlling time, freezing the action, for example, at 1/1000th of a second, or shooting blur subject at 1/15th of a second. On paper, it is great. But in order to lock that shutter speed, it actually plays with your aperture and your ISO. So it locks the shutter speed and plays with the two other parameters in order to adjust. And the dark side is that if you lock 1/1000th of a second and you're in the shade, your aperture can't go wide enough and your photos will come out really dark or with tons of ISO noise because your ISO will have shot up through the roof in order to compensate and keep that 1,000 of a second when you were just shooting a static object that didn't even need 1,000 of a second. You see, that's a big drawback with shutter speed priority, which is why I much prefer aperture priority, because it won't do that. It won't completely destroy your image with extremely high ISO and a high shutter speed that wasn't necessary. In shutter speed priority, you may end up with two parameters that are completely off that you didn't want. The aperture that went way too low, for example, and your ISO that shot up way too high. And yeah, in those circumstances, it's not great. Now, it's not a mode I don't use. I want to preface that. It's just a mode that can be a little dangerous if you're not extremely aware of your settings. So when do I actually use it? I use it for intentional artistic effects only. For example, if I'm panning with a cyclist and I want that panning, I know kind of in what environment I am in. I'm not changing from a bright street to an extremely dark street. I will use that and shoot, for example, 150 per second. Outside of that, I absolutely never use that mode. By the way, all the photos you see are mine. They're not AI generated or stock photos, and they're edited with my Lightroom presets. If you want, you can grab them in the description. In this day and age, honestly, I prefer to say it. Now, have you ever heard of P mode? That's also a mode that exists. It's a little smarter than auto, but it's not as smart as what I'm about to show you. Basically, in P mode, you can change the aperture and the shutter speed, and the camera will kind of balance things out by itself. It's like a half auto, but not fully semi-auto mode. So I don't recommend it. Do this instead. I promised you a cheat code at the very beginning of this video. So here it is. Manual plus auto ISO. Wait. You set your aperture for the creative decision, right? Do you want a lot of context in an image? Or do you actually want to isolate the subject a lot? And then you set the shutter, motion, decision, freeze, or flow. How do you want it to be? And last but not least, instead of setting the ISO, you leave it in auto. So the camera handles completely your ISO, the math, and you have 100% creative control, zero mental math to do. This is how Pro actually shoots. Well, it's not that we're doing math normally, but it's so much faster. And exposure compensation starts working in manual plus auto ISO. So it surprises people a lot, but if you dial it, for example, to -1, your exposure compensation, you're gonna get that more cinematic camera mood. And if you dial it up, you'll get that emotional, light, airy mood, but you're still in manual and you can still control your shutter speed and your aperture. The ISO is completely off to the camera and you just play with your exposure compensation to change a little bit the mood in your images. Remember that scene at the beginning with the people walking in the ray of light and the dark background? This is the perfect case scenario where you want to choose your shutter speed so that you freeze those people. Also choose your depth of field so you're actually not missing them. But you don't care about the ISO. You want the ISO to be set by the camera. You just want the compensation to go to -1 or -2 to keep the background dark and your subject exposed in the highlights. And in this scenario, you may want to go the extra route to actually forget about the exposure compensation and switch from evaluative to spot mode for your camera metering, so that the camera meters the light on where it is the brightest and then gets you the right exposure without even having to change that exposure compensation. There's this little button called the auto exposure lock at the back that you can press on and you can actually set it to be a spot metering mode. It is an extremely helpful tip. So you set your camera AEL and spot metering mode. You can even have it in toggle, so you press 1 and forget it. You don't even need to change your exposure compensation in manual with auto ISO. It is literally the fastest and most efficient way for me to get the images and the creative mood I have in mind. Look, if you want to master exactly how to use spot metering and what different metering modes do for perfect exposure every time, watch my video on the BBE technique right after this one. The link is on the screen. All those settings, I've laid them out for very common situation in my free everyday photography cheat sheet. Grab it from the link in the description so you have it on your phone the next time you go out shooting. Now, here is a recap table I want you to take a screenshot of if that's not already done. If the light is changing fast, the motion is not critical, shoot in aperture priority with the minimum shutter speed set and use the exposure compensation to dial in the mood. Then if you need to freeze motion, it's non-negotiable and you know the risk, use the shutter speed priority mode and keep your eyes open on the ISO just in case it goes a little too crazy in darker environments. Then if you want full creative control with mood, dialing in any type of light, you go in manual plus auto ISO and use the auto exposure lock hack. Now if you're still building your instincts, shoot in aperture priority mode with a minimum shutter speed in fast or 1/250th of a second or 1/125th if you're afraid because it's darker. And honestly, there's no shame. It's a great mode. I use it in 85% of cases, whether it's professional or family or friends. It is an incredible mode for storytelling that focuses on the essential. Look, the goal of all this is very simple. Get the math out of the way so you can be present and enjoy the moment. The best mode is the one that disappears and lets you be a photographer. That's what we're doing, right? Pick one mode from this video, not all of them, and try them individually. Go out this week, shoot with it, see what feels good, and remember, action beats information. So if this video helped you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps with the channel to reach more photographers. And if you want to go deeper, watch that BBE technique video on screen right now, or watch that one on the BBF. Now get out there, go shoot, try something different, try something new. I'll see you in the next one.